Good morning. On October 1st of this year, CVS, the drugstore, stopped selling cigarettes and tobacco products. They said that selling that particular product does not align and even undermines their company goal of helping people to better health. They took this action admitting that it would likely hurt their profitability. In 2010, the Church of Sweden announced that it would divest from energy companies that are extracting fossil fuels in favor of investing in companies that specialize in renewable energy. On the 23rd of September of this year, the Church of Sweden announced it completed its divestment process and its assets of nearly $700 million are now completely fossil-free. They gave two reasons. Second is the negative environmental impact from current rates of burning fossil fuels. And first was that an exhaustible product is a long-term financial risk. I wonder what neighbor Norway thinks about that, where oil accounts for 20% of the GDP, 30% of state revenue, and 50% of national exports. I can tell you who would not like these financial decisions. The master of slaves in our gospel reading, who is described as a harsh man in our gospel, that reaps harvests where he does not sow seeds. How does this harsh master make money? He steals it. He takes the crops that villages grow. He is one who values profit above all else, no matter the impact or the means. Ethical concerns that hurt the bottom line of profitability are of no concern to him. 1 talent is an ancient unit of money that would equal the yearly gross domestic product, the amount of money and value of goods produced in 1 year by a small village of 30 to 50 people in Israel at that time. When the master says, "I reap where I do not sow, and I gather where I do not scatter," he is saying he stole the wealth, the hard work, the livelihood of an entire village to get that 1 talent. 5 talents was about equal to how much money a small town of 500 could come up with. Nazareth, where Jesus was from, was about 500 people at the time. This man steals the agricultural livelihood of whole communities. His expectation, the way he expects his servants to make money in his absence, is to essentially sell the villages back their own food. He was operating under pseudo-fiefdom economic rules. The man, like a typical landed lord, used hired muscle to steal the village's crops and then sold the crops for money. He takes that money and sets up lending schemes. The villagers now don't have enough food to live on, so they have to go buy their own food back. And worse yet, they don't have the resources to keep up their farm, so they have to borrow the money they need from the man who stole their crops. The slaves are expected to keep up this system of extortion. They are supposed to reflect the master's greed at the expense of others. They are to extort as he would extort. The Bible specifically prohibits lending at interest in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, the authoritative law of Moses. This interest-charging, law-breaking, harsh man who reaps where he does not sow is not a model for godly behavior. He is not the hero in the story. He is not to be seen as the image of God. The most common way to preach this gospel is as a stewardship sermon about using the gifts and resources that God has given you productively. Don't be lazy is the message. Gifts and resources like money, the ability to sing or do accounting, oil, crops of corn, or investments. Put them all to productive use. However, the expectation of the slaves in the reading is not to use their God-given creative skills and organizational talents to create more economy, growth in the middle class, as the typical stewardship sermon would have me preach. The expectation of the harsh man is for his slaves to keep up the stealing, keep the extortion racket going. Where this story comes up in Matthew's gospel is just after Jesus enters Jerusalem for the last week of his life. Jesus had spent all day in the temple teaching. He lamented for Jerusalem, saying, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you." He had taught that day to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And now evening has come. And he has gone up a hill that overlooks Jerusalem called the Mount of Olives. He is just with his disciples at the time, and they are asking Jesus questions, trying to understand the events and teaching of that day. It was just the day before that Jesus had arrived in Jerusalem, and on that day he turned over the tables of the money changers that had set up shop in God's holy temple. In this story about the extortionist and his slaves, it is like Jesus is assessing the state of Jerusalem at that time. He is looking out over Jerusalem, and from his vantage point of a hill just east, can see little villages of 35, 50, and 100 scattered around Jerusalem. Jesus looks down on Jerusalem and sees all kinds of people visiting it during the time leading up to the Jewish festival of Passover. People were there from small towns of 500 like Nazareth and Galilee, where he and his disciples were from. Jerusalem's permanent inhabitants were about 25,000 at the time, but another 100,000 could be there on any day in the form of religious pilgrims, temporarily stationed Roman soldiers, traveling business people, even whole nomad tribes in the city to trade. It is like Jesus looks down on Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives and can barely see the city of God it is supposed to be. But he can easily see the bustle of an economic center. From the Mount of Olives, Jesus is looking at a Roman fortress that towers over the city where soldiers go out and collect taxes from. The Roman fortress has been strategically placed to butt up against and loom over the temple. Jesus is looking at a temple with its 50,000 Passover religious pilgrims. From these faithful travelers, the city's businessmen make their livelihood, changing their money, selling them food and lodging. Jesus is looking on Jerusalem and sees a city built on religious and militaristic extortation. Today's gospel is not a stewardship story about using the talents God has given you, but a mirror that Jesus holds up to reflect back the time's cultural and economic values. The question for us is, do we see ourselves and our own circumstances in this mirror? Are we participants in a world ethic that, in the words of the gospel, is all those who have, more will be given? But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. I said earlier that the extortionist master in our gospel wouldn't like the decisions made by CVS and the Church of Sweden that mean a loss in profit for ethical reasons. But how about you? How would you feel if the church got into ethical investing at the expense of profit? This church, Lutheran Church of the Master, has investments. With our investments, the church is able to pay for beautifully, professionally sung solos. Our investments pay for instrumentalists. Our investments pay for the communion wine and the study Bibles I give out. When I got here, the investments paid for a quarter of the pastor's salary and half of the organist's. Thanks to your increased generosity, the investments have been freed up and to some extent are able to pay for projects that extend our ministry, like improving the sound system and the upcoming banners on the exterior of the church that will let people know there is a church here. A couple of weeks ago, we had a man come to church who judged our bake-off. He is more specifically our investment manager. And to make the money we need for all these things of ministry, he invests in companies like Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Boeing. Boeing is the second largest defense contractor in the world, with 45% of its earnings coming from defense. And it has made us $11,000. Raytheon made us about $8,000 and also makes missiles. It also employs over 60,000 workers and is established enough to be on my computer's spell check. Our stock in General Dynamics is up $2,000 this year, and they make submarines, jets, tanks, and missiles. We invest in oil through ExxonMobil and a company called ConocoPhillips, which is the third largest oil company in the U.S. We also have money with Pfizer, a pharmaceutical company who makes Viagra. To an extent, Lutheran Church of the Master is in the business of oil, guns, and sex. Before you start imagining a Scud missile with LCM painted on the side, these mentioned investments represent about 11% of the whole. We also invest in Nestle, and chocolate is a little more palatable to most investment tastes. Beyond making Viagra, Pfizer also makes chapstick. The economic picture of our investments in the world's economy is actually more diversified than just oil, guns, and sex. I'm not recommending we divest. Please hear that. On the consequential end for us at Lutheran Church of the Master of a large, complex international economy of investments and debated economic products is whether our professional choir members are here to sing something beautiful, a song that inspires and transports you away from the worries of life with the assurance of God's ever-present love. As I've told our finance folks here at the church, we've got to have at least a 4% return. So if I'm honest with you, your own pastor sees himself in the mirror that Jesus holds up. A 4% return, no matter how you get there. In 1987, when the ELCA voted to form the largest Lutheran denomination in the U.S., they also voted that the pension fund for retired pastors should be invested ethically. The board in charge of those investments refused because they would be doing a financial disservice to the pastors. The board was removed on subsequent elections. The new board has advocated for socially responsible investing, in their own words, and discourages investments in companies that profit from the production of alcohol, military weapons, and pornography, for example. Since then, some pastors have sued the ELCA for not making the money that can keep up with pension promises. The typical stewardship sermon villainizes the guy with one talent that didn't invest as lazy. But what if he was seeking justice? What if he was refusing to participate in the scam? What if encapsulated in this one talent defiance Is Jesus looking down on Jerusalem and saying, I won't play your religious, militaristic extortion game? If so, then we are learning that the consequence to rejecting the world's profit-driven policies are getting rejected, getting fired, being cast into the outer darkness, and the cross. The slaves keep up the extortion out of fear of their master. If the servants didn't extort, if they stood up with even a shred of decency, not wanting to cheat their neighbors, then they would be cast into the outer darkness. Jesus walks down off the Mount of Olives, publicly rejecting what has become of the city of God, rejecting what he sees in humanity's mirror, and is killed for it. Today's story is a mirror that says, when it comes to money, you look like this. When it comes to the rejection of money, it will look like this. Okay, I can't leave it on that dark of a note. I truly do believe that Jesus intends the story to end in that super, really dark place of self-reflection, but I've got to give some resolution, something hopeful. The outer darkness, so here it is. So the outer darkness and rejection mentioned at the end of our gospel is not God's. That darkness and rejection is what the world will do to those who stand for economic justice, not what God does to his people. In fact, God's love embraces you in the darkness. If you're in the outer darkness for standing up for principles of love and justice, Jesus is already there. God in Jesus Christ enters the darkness that the world cast you into because you stood up for justice, and God in Jesus is a light that shines in that darkness. The darkness cannot overcome the light of God in you. May you be blessed hearing this sermon as I have been blessed preaching it. Amen.